right, so welcome everyone to the Advocate Integration Series. This is session number 2, and the title is A Reckoning on Race, Black Lives Matter, and Global Anti-Racist Advocacy. We are very lucky today to have 3 amazing Advocate LLC faculty members here to join us and to share their expertise. Today, you'll be hearing from Dr. Kenneth Serban in history, Dr. Mei Fu from ethnic studies, and Dr. Susanna Walter from environmental and ocean sciences. So we're very glad that you're here today. I'm just going to take like 2 minutes of your time to kind of set the stage for why we do this and what this means to you in terms of what's expected of you this semester and next semester, and how it kind of all fits into your time here at USD. So first, I'm just sharing with you what our entire series looks like. Some of you were fortunate to attend the first session in September, and then here we are today, session number 2. And then in a few more weeks, we're going to have our final session, number 3, on climate change. And that will feature, I apologize, this is an old one. I thought I had this fixed. Not Dr. O'Shea, we have Dr. Parkinson from anthropology who will be joining us, as well as Dr. Tyrrell from political science, and myself, I'm Dr. Kanzler from sociology. So if you have attended all of them, amazing, that's great. We encourage you to do so. There's absolutely no limit on how many of these wonderful events you can attend, but you are required to attend one. So we are happy that you are here. These events are part of first year integration. We hold these events so that you can start thinking about and practicing recognizing how different disciplines and different departments, different perspectives can really be connected to each other when you are thinking about advocacy, or in the case today, when you are thinking about specifically Black Lives Matter, anti-racism, and the like. So you're going to be asked in the coming weeks to complete an assignment. It's called the First Year Integration Assignment. And hopefully your faculty have already talked to you about this, about the expectations. But in that assignment, you're going to be asked specifically to recognize broad connections between the disciplines that you're hearing about today, and how you can draw connections from these talks to each other so that you can understand racism and anti-racism a little bit better. We're also going to ask you to articulate how the integration of these different perspectives actually enhances your ability to understand these problems. In addition to thinking about how these connections are drawn to the topic of racism, we're also going to ask you to articulate how they are connected to our broader LLC topic of advocacy. And so, as I mentioned, you are demonstrating this new practice, this new ability through this assignment that you're going to be completing in the next few weeks. And then in the spring, you're going to be demonstrating your learning through an integration project that you're going to be completing in your spring LLC course. So in the next few weeks, you're going to have the opportunity to register for another class in the Advocate LLC, and you are going to be introduced to a new perspective for understanding advocacy. And through that final first year project, you're going to be able to draw connections between your spring class and the class that you're taking this semester, to talk about how they connect together to understand kind of a broader issue and topic related to advocacy. So that's what we're doing here. As I mentioned when I met you way back in the first day of class, this is part of USD's model of increasing integration and putting integration into your entire curriculum. So here you are in your first year, you're being exposed to different perspectives and you're being able to draw connections between them. We hope that over the course of your entire academic career here at USD, you're going to continue practicing making connections between your classes. And then during your junior or senior year, you're going to have the opportunity through a final core project to be able to take this integrated body of knowledge that you put together over the course of your 4 years and apply them to a project of your own. So you have that to look forward to. All right, so I don't want to take up any more time. I want to jump in so we can enjoy the full amount of time that's available to us to hear these wonderful presentations and then to engage in a robust discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to our speaker. I'm going to stop sharing now and turn it over to Dr. Kenneth Serban.
I'm renaming my, oh, I'm already renamed. Yeah, one thing that Gabriella of the LLC program asked us to do is everybody, if you haven't done so already, make sure that you properly rename your video with your first or last name, because sometimes it doesn't come up automatically, or maybe you're using someone else's Zoom access. So thank you for doing that. So we have a good record of who participated and who said what in the Q&A, so on and so forth. So I'm going to share my slides here from this presentation. Let me get that going. Let's see. Okay. It always takes me a second or two. And I'm one of those people who doesn't pay attention to the chat while I'm talking. So if you have a question, save that for the Q&A, because I'm not going to really be able to jump into the chat and look at it. I'm one of these people still learning to do multiple things at the same time with this Zoom system here. I'm a little intimidated when someone, as my students know, when someone chats. So anyway, here's the slide that I want to share. So my talk is titled Society and Race in 19th Century Latin America, the complex story of Benito Juárez, Mexico's first president of indigenous heritage. And so let's jump right in. First of all, I wanted to say a couple words about history and integration. What do we do in a history course? Specifically, what are we doing in my LLC course? So this is taken directly from the syllabus. So modern Latin America, my course, and I have 15 students in that course with me, fulfills the core requirement for historical inquiry, critical thinking, and information literacy. That's known as EHSI. And in my course, we have 4 learning outcomes that history students, whether they are just taking this course for one time, but if they become minors or majors, certainly focus on this in even more detail, in greater depth, are these kinds of outcomes. Number 1, students will identify and formulate significant historical questions regarding Latin American history. So we focus on formulating questions. Learning outcome 2, students will access information about Latin American history effectively and use information ethically and legally, meaning that we always cite our sources. We recognize that we're obtaining information from these sources. And we do focus on documents such as primary sources, things produced by the actual historical actors. Learning outcome 3, students will analyze a range of precisely primary sources in Latin American history, articulate historical context, and use these sources as evidence to support an argument. So this week, for example, we read a book called Child of the Dark, which is about an Afro-Brazilian woman who was living in a slum in Sao Paulo, Brazil in the late 1950s, and wrote a diary of her experience raising her children as a single mother in a shanty town, and being Afro-Brazilian, meaning that she was a descendant of the African slaves who were brought to Latin America. And finally, learning outcome 4, students will weigh against competing scholarly interpretations of Latin American history and learn to employ various interpretive strategies regarding these themes. I should say students will weigh against each other these competing scholarly interpretations. So this is what we do in a history course. And so that should give you an idea of what you can discuss in your assignments if you're writing on this today. Let's take an overview now of Latin America. There are a number of important points here. And by talking about Latin America, the first thing we need to mention is that we're looking at a different part of the world here. in terms of race and racism and discrimination. So to understand Latin America, we need to recall that it was a place that was colonized primarily by the Spaniards and the Portuguese, starting around the time of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. And so for more than 3 centuries, the Spaniards and the Portuguese controlled most of the Americas, including a large part of what is today the United States. In the study of Latin America, we always take into account the fact that there were, at the time of the arrival of the Europeans, and continue to be in the present, large numbers of indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, most of those indigenous peoples died out because of disease. My course is very relevant, for example, to the current pandemic, because we talk about the fact that these indigenous peoples could not resist the diseases brought by the Europeans, which led to the decimation of many of these peoples. But many of them also survived into the present. Another key point about Latin America is that increasingly scholars think of Latin America as Afro-Latin America. And that is because of the legacy of slavery in Latin America. Millions of slaves were brought to the Americas by the Portuguese, the Spaniards, and other slave trading European nations. Many, many more slaves than were ever brought to the United States. Brazil, the country I studied, for example, brought in almost 4 million slaves. And it's been referred to, in fact, by one of its leaders, its former leaders, as one of the largest African countries in the world because of that African heritage. 4 million brought into Brazil almost. That compares to 500,000 brought into the United States. So Brazil had 8 times many more imported slaves than the United States. And the question for the people of Latin America became, throughout their history, in particular in the 1800s, when those countries became independent. They broke off the shackles of colonial rule and became independent nations in the 1800s. And in the 1800s, as independent nations, they had to start justifying their position in a world of white racial superiority. The notion of white racial superiority was something that was developed in the mid to late 1800s and became a dominant ideology in much of the world, and in particular in Europe and Latin America. You see at the bottom there 2 paintings. On the lower left, you see a painting that illustrates the type of people in Latin America who resulted from the colonial system. They were referred to, and still are referred to, in scholarly writings as mulattoes. You see there on the left, a Spanish, a Portuguese man. On the right, an African woman. And they had a child who was of mixed heritage. Those people were referred to as mulattoes. In fact, in our class, we read precisely a novel called Mulatto, talking about that phenomenon. Latin America also had another type of people that were of mixed heritage, known as mestizos. Again, on the left, a Spanish or Portuguese man of white color, white skin color. On the right, an indigenous woman, and together they produced mestizos. And over 5 centuries of the history of Afro-Latin America, there's been a lot of intermixing. There are dozens and dozens of groups that have been classified as a result of all of this ethnic intermixing that occurred in that part of the world. And so in the study of Afro-Latin America, the concepts of ethnicity and identity and the phenomenon of racism are always key. And that is one of the things that we spend a lot of time on in our course, as my students know. Now, today I wanted to talk about this in this very complex case study of an indigenous man named Benito Juarez, who lived from 1806 to 1872, who became Mexico's first president of indigenous heritage. There is a painting of Benito Juarez. There are actually photographs of him near the end of his life when photography was available, but this is one of the more known images of him in his middle age. Juarez was a Zapotec native who spoke no Spanish, which is Mexico's main language, until the age of 12. After becoming a lawyer, Benito Juarez achieved great success in politics. He served as president of Mexico on 3 occasions, from 1858 to 1861, then from 1861 to 1867, and then finally from 1867 to 1872. And he did die in office during that last term. Benito Juarez was a native of Oaxaca. On the right, you see a map of Mexico. The red dot there, or the red star in the middle, is Mexico City. That's the capital. Hopefully you can see my cursor moving. That's the capital of Mexico. To the south, you see what I'm underlining here, the city of Oaxaca, which is located in the state of Oaxaca. It's the capital of the state of Oaxaca. And over to the left, you see a blow up of the state of Oaxaca, which is in the deep south of Mexico. That part of Mexico was and continues to be an area with a very strong indigenous presence. In fact, here in Southern California, there are, over the last couple of decades, many immigrants who have come in from Oaxaca to live and work here in Southern California. In fact, today on the radio, I heard or maybe it was yesterday, I heard a report about a really, really good Oaxaca restaurant in Los Angeles. So the people of Oaxaca are leaving their cultural imprint here on Southern California. So this shows you that Benito Juarez came from this part of Mexico, which is historically an area that has continued to have a very strong indigenous presence up to this very moment. So it's a nation of mestizos, but it's also a nation where there is still a strong indigenous presence. And these people also speak in many cases, their native language, their indigenous language, in addition to Spanish. Here is an example of from the late 20th century, a photograph of a woman from Oaxaca, and illustrating further the point that I've just made, that most of southern Mexico still has this very strong indigenous presence. You see her there with her indigenous facial features, the brown skin, typical of the natives, indigenous peoples of Mexico, and working with a traditional craft that was developed by many of the indigenous peoples after the conquest, where the conquerors had them work in these crafts, and many of these have continued into the present. So this is an example of the strength of the indigenous presence in Mexican history, which is a question that the Mexican nation has struggled with over the decades, as the indigenous people have sought greater equality. So Benito Juarez, therefore, was from that part of Mexico where the Zapotecs are native to. Why do we study him? Well, as I said, he was the first indigenous president of Mexico, and as such, he achieved great accomplishments. He came to personify Mexican nationalism because he expelled the French from Mexican territory. Part of the idea of white racial superiority in the late 1800s was this notion of the Europeans, nations, that they should go out and conquer other nations. They ended up conquering most of Africa in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And also there was an attempt to move back into Latin America. The French actually occupied Mexico for 7 years, but they were defeated by Benito Juarez and the loyalist army members of Mexico, the generals who stayed to the side of Benito Juarez rather than going over to the French. So Benito Juarez symbolized the reconquest of the Americas. This has been called the second independence of the Americas. But I said he was a complex individual. Benito Juarez also was responsible for bringing about the reform laws. These are very famous laws in Mexico that are a part of the country to the present moment. And these reform laws led to the separation of church and state in Mexico, and also led to the seizing of church properties by the government so that the Catholic Church could not have so much political and social power in the country. Why was Benito Juarez doing this? Well, because he was a classical liberal. Classical liberalism in the 1800s is what we would today call conservatism in the United States. The idea of free enterprise, individual initiative, and the notion of private property and the buying and selling of private property in as easy a manner as possible. So those are some of the underlying pillars of classical liberalism. So he was an indigenous individual, but as a lawyer, he became this classical liberal. And the liberals and the conservatives in Mexico, who were in favor of defending church and state staying together, they actually fought a civil war, which Benito Juarez's forces won. So as a result of these achievements, there was a political cult to Juarez that developed in Mexico. Benito Juarez has been hallowed as a figure, as a great leader of Mexico, and as a person who did bring in this idea of separating church and state. And because of his native heritage, he was underestimated. And he was also criticized because he did use at times dictatorial tactics. And in expelling the French and in carrying out other operations before his presidency and during his presidency, he was accused by some of having sacrificed Mexican interests to the U.S. At one point in exile, he spent time in New Orleans. This was before he became president. He was put into exile by one of the dictators of Mexico at the time, and as a result, he ended up making cigars in New Orleans, Louisiana. So he had close ties to the United States. And one of the outcomes of Benito Juarez's actions were that these reform laws not only took property from the Catholic Church, but they took property from the communal villages, the communal properties that were held by indigenous peoples and that had been held over centuries. So this is one of the criticisms of him as a leader, that he was of indigenous heritage, but ended up doing something that ultimately harmed the indigenous peoples. So that's one of the complexities of history that we look at. Narratives are not always simple. Narratives are complex when we look at history and look at how individuals act and how they are shaped by the ideas of their period, such as the classical liberalism, which was very popular in Latin America in the 1800s. To finish, let's see, how are we doing? Oh, I better move here quickly.
Yeah, if we could wrap up in like a minute, Dr. Serban,
Okay,
I apologize.
so this is my last slide. So the 19th century, what happened then in Afro-Latin America? European racial theories came to dominate. And as a result, the Latin American elite ended up seeing itself as a part of European civilization. The tragic solutions for this European elite was to carry out warfare against indigenous peoples mestizos, and mulattoes. There was also an attempt to stimulate white European immigration to Latin America. And this was part of an ideology known as whitening, whereby the people of Latin America sought to improve their social position by intermarrying with people of lighter skin and or by achieving economic and educational success so that they could present themselves as being white and successful as opposed to being mestizo and mulatto and unsuccessful. Juarez represented the exception that proved the rule. Although in the 20th century, Mexico and other countries began to at least partially value their indigenous heritage. And in the 21st century, vast inequalities still exist in Afro-Latin America, often based on ethnic heritage. Thank you for your attention. And after the others, I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Serban. Now I am happy to introduce Dr. Mei Fu from the Department of Ethnic Studies.
Hi, I'm trying to figure out this slide thing. Okay, does that pop up? Does that work?
Yep, I see it.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here. And thank you to Julia Kanzler for being our amazing faculty coordinator. I always appreciate the chance to share space with my colleagues and my students. My name is Mei Fu, and I'm Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies. Before I begin my overview of BLM, I want to say a few words about ethnic studies. It's the first and only academic discipline to come out of university student activism. In 1968, Black, Latinx, Asian American, American Indian, and white students at San Francisco State University formed a multiracial coalition called the Third World Liberation Front. This coalition of students, just like you, could no longer accept a Eurocentric education that failed to address the salience of race and racism in the US. They rejected curriculum that failed to examine how race, class, sexual orientation, gender, and other social formations are not only embedded in, but foundational to this country's socioeconomic and political structure. They could no longer tolerate college curricula that disrespected and criminalized their communities, that didn't give them the knowledge or skills they needed to understand life and death issues facing their communities. Issues like police brutality, institutional racism, inadequate health and housing, and other forms of structural violence. They demanded what they called a relevant education, an education that empowers all students with the tools they need to dismantle systems of unearned power and privilege and replace them with sustainable and humanizing solutions. The student strike lasted for 5 months. It's the longest student strike in US history, and it resulted in the formation of ethnic studies, which again is an academic discipline that analyzes how race, class, gender, and sexual orientation structure every aspect of our society and trains students how to advocate and organize for social justice in everything they do. So it's an honor to speak with you about Black Lives Matter today. I do so as a student of the Black freedom struggle and with deep gratitude for Black communities who are leading the way for our collective liberation. In I'm dating myself here. In 2013, what started as a love letter to Black people became a hashtag and the moniker for the most significant national and global grassroots movement in over half a century. Black Lives Matter is a rich, unapologetic reckoning with the history of US racial capitalism and anti-Black racism. It is a deep dive into the contradictions and possibilities of the present and a portal into a better, more liberated, more just, and more beautiful future than that we had previously only dared to imagine. Today, I'm going to discuss 3 important points about the movement: the founders, one of their policy platforms, and their invitation. So first, the founders. All of us have been exposed to Black Lives Matter, but fewer of us are familiar with its founders. And so I'm going to play a short video so you can hear them speak about the movement in their own words. So let me get that. Here we go. All right.
Y'all ready for this? Revival when we first created it, actually. In that moment, I think we knew that we were onto something that was resonating in a very deep way.
The hashtag is this phenomenon now. Yeah, you want to go there? People were tweeting us like, hey, didn't y'all create Black Lives Matter? And then all of a sudden, it's like the Black Lives Matter movement, and then none of us are actually there to tell the story of the Black Lives Matter. The narrative has really evolved to this weird thing of, oh, you know, again, our Black women are fighting for our Black men. And it's like, wait a minute, what? No, we're fighting for all of us. All right, let me just set the record straight.
My name is Opal Smeddy.
My name is Patrice Cullors.
I'm Alicia Garza.
We are the founders of hashtag Black Lives Matter.
I am born and raised in the Bay Area in California. There's not many of us left. We're almost like unicorns. I come from a long line of strong Black women. My grandmother was a domestic worker. My mom did domestic work. A lot of my background in organizing comes from organizing with women.
I come to this work because I am the daughter of Nigerian immigrants who are actually undocumented for most of my childhood, possibly facing deportation. That to me really shaped my entire kind of formative years.
I grew up in Los Angeles and witnessed a significant amount of state violence. I remember the police officer who would patrol our block and would harass my siblings. And I remember feeling frightened most of the time. So my coming into this work has to do with the fight for Black lives.
We have breaking news tonight in the case of the unarmed Black teenager shot dead by a crime
When
watch.
Trayvon Martin was murdered by George Zimmerman, this was a case where a child had literally been stalked and killed just steps away from home. The conversation that was happening in the media was, what did Trayvon do to cause his own death?
The reason Trayvon Martin died was because he looked a certain way. He was wearing a hoodie, and that way is how gangstas look.
Thinking about my 14-year-old brother and literally not being able to sleep because I was like, this cannot be.
When it was announced that the jury had acquitted George Zimmerman of all charges, it actually felt like I got punched in the gut. So I went on social media to try to find words for what was happening. And what I wanted in that moment was some love for us. And so I wrote a love letter to Black people on Facebook. And I said, Black people, I love you, I love us, we matter, our lives matter, Black lives matter. And my sister here threw a hashtag in front of it. She was like, that's the business right there. And then my sister Opal said, I have all these skills and I can help build this out. We need people to have a space to tell their stories. We need folks to have a space to collaborate together, to strategize together, so that we can build the power that we need in order to get free.
When we develop Black Lives Matter,
Let me get back to my screen here. Do you see my slides? Yeah, okay. Too many windows up. All right. So if you were all visible, I would ask you a series of questions about whether you knew the founders were women, whether you knew that they were also queer. And I think, what I've found is that most people don't realize that the founders of BLM are Black and queer women. And this elision of these women in mainstream media and popular consciousness amounts to what they describe as the theft of Black queer women's work. Instead of the respect and adulation that charismatic heterosexual white men routinely receive, these Black queer women founders were rendered invisible and non-relevant. More than that, not seeing and lifting up Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi means that we miss what they teach us about intersectionality as an embodied politics. As queer and Black women from working class and immigrant backgrounds, they understand marginalization and exclusion in the Black community and outside of it. Their multiple and intersecting identities mean that they have an intimate understanding of how state-sanctioned discrimination targets Black people and disenfranchises queer women. When they declare Black Lives Matter, it was never simply a response to police violence. It is, at its heart, a call to love and protect all Black lives, especially those who are queer and trans, disabled, undocumented, folks with records, women, and everyone along the gender spectrum. When Colors, Garza, and Tometi center the most marginalized members of the Black community in their vision for collective freedom, they show us how to practice intersectionality as a liberatory politics that refuses to claim a path forward if it means degrading or excluding others. That's my first point. My second point that I want to explore is the movement's policy platform. There's actually, there's 6 platforms. I'm just going to look at one. In 2014, a year after the inception of Black Lives Matter, the Movement for Black Lives was formed as a coalitional space for Black organizations to come together and engage in critical dialogue, build strategy, and collaborate. It's a collective of more than 170 Black-led organizations in the US who have articulated a common vision and agenda for Black liberation. M4BL's Vision for Black Lives is a collectively authored comprehensive policy agenda with 6 different policy platforms. I just want to very briefly discuss the first platform, which is End the War on Black People, which they define as the reallocation of funds at the federal, state, and local levels from policing and incarceration to long-term community-based safety strategies. One step in that agenda is the defunding of police. I'm sure you've heard this term kind of floating around for the past several months, if not much longer. Given the events of the past summer and extending, of course, long before that, we know a few things about the relationship of police to Black communities. First of all, we know that police do not keep Black communities safe. Black people are killed are kind of more, 3 times more likely to be murdered by police than whites. Police have killed 164 Black people in the first 8 months of 2020. Sexual violence is the second most common form of police brutality and primarily targets Black women. Almost half of all people murdered by the police have disabilities. 98.3% of killings by police from 2013 to 2020 did not result in officers being charged with the crime. And of course, this slide shows disproportionate numbers of imprisonment along the lines of race and gender. And again, despite mainstream perceptions, the institution of policing actually brings more danger, more surveillance, and more harm into Black communities, not less. The second point around defunding the police is that policing is overwhelmingly a social service. Here's a graph based on data collected in 2015 from the Philadelphia Police Department. The size of each box in that picture corresponds to the volume of incidences recorded that year. And again, despite what we've been socialized to imagine, only a very small number of incidents are actually related to violent crimes or even drug-related crimes. In fact, the vast majority of incidents have nothing to do with violent crime, yet national, state, and local governments spend $155 billion per year maintaining a heavily militarized police force that systematically terrorizes and incarcerates BIPOC communities. National and international studies consistently show that community safety, if that's really the goal, is determined not by punitive policing systems, but by the presence of and access to basic human rights. That is, access to things like quality public education, healthy food, affordable housing, a living wage, and healthcare. These are things that are far more successful in reducing crime than police, jails, or prison. So kind of imagine the sort of society we could have, the sort of safety we would enjoy if we spent $155 billion a year putting trained social workers, addiction counselors, mental health practitioners, and housing advocates on the streets and in our neighborhoods instead of military-grade weapons. The Defund Police campaign in the M4BL policy platform thus seeks to reduce, reallocate, and redirect funding away from ineffective police departments that terrorize and traumatize Black communities and invest directly in solutions that are proven nationally and globally to reduce crime. And my final point is a long quote. You know, I already broke the cardinal rule of having way too much text on a single slide, and I don't want to make it worse by reading it. I don't think we have time to read it out loud, so you can kind of just like take a look at it silently. That would be great. I just have just another minute or so of just thoughts about this. So Black freedom, our freedom, okay? So what Garza names in this quote, she names societal structures that oppress Black people, and she says that dismantling them doesn't just benefit Black people, it benefits all people, okay? And so, sorry, so my final point is that it's actually a phrase. My final point is actually a phrase, which is when Black people get free, everybody gets free. So that's what I wanted to talk about. So again, in this quote, she's naming societal structures that oppress Black people and says that dismantling these structures doesn't just benefit Black people, it benefits all people. Defunding the police and investing in community-centered safety benefits Black people and all people, right? Creating access to healthcare, jobs, education, and affordable housing doesn't just lift up the lives of Black people, it lifts up the lives of all people. And so I think the argument that all lives matter is an irony, because supporting Black lives means that you support all lives. So the difference, however, is that Black Lives Matter is also an invitation. It's an invitation to stand in anti-racist solidarity with Black people. It asks us to root out the anti-Blackness that is embedded in our lives and join their struggle for our collective liberation. The failure to see that is a reflection of our own fears and our own insecurities, right? Of our own traumas and our own anti-Blackness. We are being invited to stand in solidarity with Black people who are putting their bodies and hearts and minds on the line so we can all be free. The question is whether we have the humility, clarity, and courage to fight for their humanity as ours. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fu. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Walter. I realize we're rapidly running out of time, so if we don't have time for dialogue, we'll have a dialogue another day or in another forum. All right, Dr. Walter.
Okay, is my screen visible? Great. Oops, it didn't go to, there we go. I'm discussing this context, not the BLM movement, Black Lives Matter movement, but just the context of Black Lives Mattering in the geosciences and where we stand today. And I come to this from, I teach EOSC 105, Natural Disasters. And essentially that's the geoscience or the physical geography, studying physical science or physical geography through the lens of natural disasters. And as in relation to our theme as advocate, we attempt to highlight disparities in the impacts of and recovery from natural disasters, that are often based on race, gender, and income as well. So these pictures here are showing some pictures of students in geology and geosciences in the 90s. You can see in the 2000s, it shifts from literally all white males to very few women, maybe one or two people of color. And then we head into 2020 and we are now trying to really work towards, we haven't achieved it, but work towards highlighting and identifying and valuing our Black students and faculty and leaders in the geosciences. So I'll go over briefly general demographics, some of the awareness that has occurred, and then what's happening now and what's new. And we can ask ourselves if we'll see true change. So this is just information about minority participation in U.S. university programs. In the blue, the darker blue is African-American enrollment. And so you can see that's increasing over time. And the lighter blue is African-American degrees. So the percentage of degrees achieved by African-Americans. And also we see a rise there. And the reason I show you that, it only goes to 2008 in this particular data. But the reason I show you that is because that's not, and we are seeing demographics that are increasing in some of the geosciences. We see minority share increasing percentages, changes in science degrees and in STEM in general, and then in the geosciences, and also in general minorities in some of these fields. However, when we go in a little further, and this is just one example from data that was collected from the Jackson School of Geosciences at University of Texas. And this is important because they considered this very important and have tried to make changes. So I'm showing this data because to the far left is the demographics, just breakdown of race in the state of Texas, then the breakdown of race at University of Texas, and then within the University of Texas, the School of Geoscience, and the green is Black students or population in each of those fields. And so you can see that there are still some major dearths in that in terms of geosciences. And so while we have, and still not enough of a percentage even at the university in general, but certainly in the School of Geosciences is really lacking. And the reason this matters, or you might not know the regular percentages, but this is just another breakdown. This is data from 2014, so I was trying to match same years. So this is what I found, so it's a little bit ago now. But this is for total, so the picture on the top breaks down all groups, so to speak. So the total minority there summed is about 38%. And the reason I had to sum it is because the bottom data that shows percentages of degrees earned by students from underrepresented minority populations, just to compare to that total because it's totaled there. It exceeds that minority in sciences and engineerings, but then drops as we go to bachelor's, master's, and PhD levels. And in the geosciences, in fact, it's less than half in terms of an associate. We're talking less than a third by the time we get to a bachelor's, and less than that, and drops even down to about a fifth when we look at PhDs in terms of percentages of the overall population. So we know that there's a gap. And why does this matter? Well, there's been one study highlighted the fact that, what do we gain from diversifying the geosciences? Well, one study found that members in diverse research groups had a positive correlation between ethnic diversity and paper citations. And that's one measure of success of research labs. They had more efficient communication with individual labs, and they also had greater collaboration between academics and other communities. So between other groups outside of their lab, whether it's the community and other different academics. It may be summarized, we can summarize the findings to say that the lack of diversity challenges our ability to address issues of environmental justice, to bring geoscience expertise to diverse communities, and to pursue research reflecting the needs and interests of our nation as a whole. So the message becomes clear. Greater diversity in geoscience leads to greater scientific and societal gains. And this isn't something we didn't know. So I highlighted a whole bunch of articles that have been out, over a number of years. Obstacles to the recruitment of minorities in geosciences, a call to action, moving the needle on the diversities. Earth science has a whiteness problem. No progress on diversity in 40 years. So we are aware of this issue, meaning we collectively, the community has identified this as a problem. But some of the steps have been very simplistic and very unsuccessful. And so at the bottom, I just summarized, this was summarized from one of the articles. Despite a growing consensus that the lack of diversity in science presents an inequity requiring action, decades of research, policies, and progress have shown that diversifying sciences is not as simple as encouraging women and minorities to earn university degrees in STEM fields. So just saying that they're getting degrees isn't enough. And so the basics of okay, well, we got more students into our university or into our program isn't enough. We're not seeing steps beyond that. It's not sufficient. So we've identified potential factors. And when I say we, I just mean the community in general, not me per se. But that, racial and ethnic representation is ingrained in a complex web of social issues. Some of the factors in this dearth include a limited exposure to geosciences. And when I say that, we talk about the earth, atmospheric, and ocean sciences in general, not biology and chemistry per se. A lack of access to outdoor spaces. It is often the experience in the outdoors that draws people to geosciences. A lack of role models and representation in the field. A lack of a sense of belonging, which speaks to the previous bullet. A lack of peers, again, same, and other stereotypes about the field itself. People not knowing what career paths it can lead to. And most historically Black colleges and universities don't offer geoscience. So again, lack of access and limited support from family, friends, or mentors because either they don't understand the field or they don't know the careers, so they want to support their child, student, friend, et cetera, in something that they can be successful in, right? And have a good life. And the geosciences in general is really diverse in and of itself. It can require field work, lab work, computer modeling, and people can be attracted to a number of different aspects of it. And so not even knowing those options often will limit someone from pursuing that. So there have been steps taken. I'll talk about one, but there are Black Outdoors projects, Black in the Geosciences, scientists pushing back to barriers to diversity in the field sciences, a project called the Field Project, Fieldwork Inspiring Expanded Leadership and Diversity, the National Association of Black Geoscientists, and a seminar called the Bridge Seminar at UMass Amherst, where they had specific goals to have speakers come that address the science as a whole, the impacts to community and mentorship of students, and sort of looking at speakers and interactions with speakers and other scientists in a more holistic way. And I showed you the data from the Jackson School of Sciences at UT Austin. This is just sort of their page where they highlight some of the steps that they've been trying to take. So, and their call is, our goal is to build a community that enables the Jackson School to mirror the diversity found in the state of Texas population so that our alumni can then foster a more inclusive geosciences community across the nation. What starts here changes the world. And so their goal is to match their state population as a representative state university in their program. Some key steps that were taken this year in response to the murder of George Floyd and the rise of Black Lives Matter have been a lot of editorials and articles on systemic racism in science and learning to change, a series of high-end organizations committing to changing practices, you know, a real call out of racism, a number of hashtags and weeks of sort of Blacks in particular aspects of sciences. And so weeks to acknowledge that. An academic and STEM shutdown in June, and a number of statements made at universities and different programs in terms of commitment. And so, like I said, a number of universities and departments around the country have acknowledged past wrongs and pledged to make changes, some verbal, some maybe quantifiable, and have identified that workplace diversity goes far past hiring, how we can work towards that. And one of the keys that they identify is, let's stop making making the people fit the workplace as it is. Let's change the workplace into a place that actually changes and builds from the people that are there. And we're not done, because we're still seeing racism in the lab and in the field, and that's still identified. Ultimately, we need more. So we need more exposure and introduction to the geosciences, to nature, to the outdoors in general. We need more support and mentorship and scholarships to be more inclusive. Internships to introduce students and kids in general and others to the geosciences. Programs at multiple levels, like that Bridge program that includes a variety of levels of the field. Retention efforts. And then a constant reflection and evaluation of what is working and what isn't. And we as individuals, whether you're inside the geoscience community or in general, I would say this could apply to anything. We can start by interrogating ourselves and continuing to do so at every level of our careers and critiquing the existing system, no matter that field. So finally, I'll just sum up with saying as a geoscience, but I put that in parentheses because I think as a community in general, a human community, we can't afford to miss out on the extraordinary talent that exists within our Black students and our Black community. And by doing so, much like May was talking about in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, we limit science and we limit solutions that we can find if we don't become more inclusive. And in the end, we all collectively can and need to do better. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Walter. So we are now 2 minutes before 2 o'clock. So I realize we don't have time to have a conversation as a group. People are, I'm sure, between classes, but I just want to take a moment to thank our wonderful speakers. And I know that they would be more than open to communicating with any of you via email, or if you're taking class with them, to talk about these talks and what contributions they made to this discussion about race and racism and anti-racist movements. Think about, after, when you're reflecting upon this, how each of these very diverse disciplinary perspectives provides just a little bit of a slice of the pie of understanding issues related to race and racism. But that if you put them all together, you might be able to understand dynamics in a little bit more of a full way. That's the primary goal that we are hoping that you come out of this with. Also, just a little plug for these wonderful faculty. If you are intrigued by the topics that they talked about today and want to hear more, please take their classes. Some of these are even being offered in our LLC in the spring. And those that aren't, you can take them outside of the LLC. I know that they are all fabulous teachers and you would all be better off for taking classes with them. So I encourage you to do so. That's all I have. I really appreciate you all being here. Very thankful to all of our speakers today and to all of you for taking time to be here. Much appreciated. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, and everybody. Thank you, May. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was great. Thank you.
You know, I was going to say it's dead hours.
Yes.
So it's good. It's good. Okay. Thanks to Ken and Suzanne and Julia for scheduling this on a Thursday versus a Monday evening.
Cole, did you want to jump in with a question?
Yeah, I was actually, I wrote a few down if it's okay, if you guys don't have anywhere to go.
Did anyone have where you need to be?
I know my next class starts at 2:30, so I'm okay.
With me, in fact.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I have a minute too. You can ask away.
Yeah, I have a few written down actually. So I think for most of these questions are for Professor Fu. If that's okay, can I start with you?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think my first question is that, and I completely agree with almost everything you said, especially within the defund police argument. But I wanted to play devil's advocate for a second, and a lot of the issues that people bring up with the defund police situation, well, with the argument and the concept of it, the first thing they say is, like, what about the violence that exists now, especially in communities that do have a lot of violence that exists within them at the moment? What happens to those communities when we start defunding the police in those situations, when police sometimes is necessary, sadly enough? I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that.
Yeah, I don't know. I was going kind of fast. I felt rushed. And so I don't know if you had a chance to look at one of the slides that actually looked at the incidences, like the total incidences in 1 year for Philly. Like Philadelphia, you know, it's a big city, it's an urban center, and it's just a little sliver. It's like, you know, I didn't have the numbers, but so it's just a visual representation, but overwhelmingly, you know, the incidences are not even drug related or violent. Like they're just, I mean, I can send you the link if you want. I have to kind of find it, but there's so many reports that say that the work that police officers do is really social services more than anything. It's not about violent crime. It's not about, you know, I mean, even drug-related crimes, which aren't violent, are really small, but on the news, we're socialized in a way to believe that they're much bigger than they are. You know, most of the issues are having to deal with, gosh, like just loitering, trespassing, noise complaints, right? It's not, you know, it's not violent. So, you know, that's a big thing. I think that's one way to answer it. And I think the other thing is that, you know, when you're trying to address issues of crime, you know, like I think you have to look at the roots of crime, which is why every study, not every, but a lot of studies, like study after study after study, both in the US and globally, evidence how giving people access to human rights like housing, food, education, healthcare, these are the largest determinants, the biggest determinants of crime rates, right? So the more access you have to human rights, the less crime there is. And that's just a global phenomenon, right? But I think in the US, we would rather spend much more money, you know, I had more statistics around the kind of percentages that cities use, like of city budgets that go into policing. So, I mean, it's in kind of my notes, but, you know, 30-40% of city budgets go just straight to the police department. What about social services? What about education? What about healthy food access? What about, you know, affordable housing? And so we're not making those choices. If we were really, if the system of mass incarceration was really about reducing crime, then we would utilize, you know, pathways that are proven to do that, but we've refused to do that. And it's because of race. Criminalization is racialized, and mass incarceration was never about crime. It was always about the control and locking up of Black and brown bodies, always from its inception.
Awesome. I mean, that's, I feel like you couldn't have answered it in a better way. Thank you so much.
No,
and then I think I had one more question in regards to, so, and this, these questions kind of mold into one, but
sorry, Susanna, you have to leave. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
You have to go. Okay.
Pop off in just a second too. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Walter. So my last question would be, I personally didn't know that the Black Lives Matter, the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement was started by Black queer women, which I think very exciting to me. That touches to me personally because I am a queer person. And I was wondering if, because this is something that I see a lot of in my social media feed, and a lot of my friends talk about this, is that a very big issue within the Black Lives Matter movement is that there is this separation of what Black Lives Matter. And there's a big problem with, I think, this big distinction on people not valuing the lives of Black trans women. And I was wondering if, I'm trying to figure out how to format my question, is that how do you think we return to that? Because to some extent, because of what we understand with the fact that even though I haven't read the letter, so I don't know if she mentions it in the love letter she'd written with the Black Lives Matter hashtag, how do we as a society, and especially for me specifically, because who am I as a white person to comment on what Black Lives Matter means? How do we as a community angle the Black Lives Matter movement more towards not just heteronormative Black lives, but Black lives of any and all sort of roles in sexualities and identities?
Yeah, that's such a great question. What did you?
I just said that was such a great question. I had to jump in just to say it was such a great question.
Yeah, I mean, Julia or Ken, do you want to answer that? I mean, I feel like, I think all of us are allies here, right? Like, we're wanting to be accomplices, all of us here, I think, from what I can see visibly. I don't want to make too many assumptions, but yeah, how do we orient to that? How do all of us? And so I don't know if it's that they have to orient to us. I think it's, that's the politics of the movement from its inception, was that it was about all lives. It was about queer lives, trans women, but yeah, Ken or Julia, did you want to respond to that?
The only thing I would add, just from a movement's perspective and teaching change making, is that there definitely seems to be a trend among younger generation of advocates and activists to see and really recognize intersectionality as a real thing, and to recognize other people's oppressions as all of our oppressions. And this is happening through these dynamic collaborations that are happening in the streets, I think, and the spaces that people share. Even thinking about our student activists on campus, they share space where they're able to really be exposed to each other and to all of the issues that used to be so very siloed in terms of advocacy. And so I think organically, we're seeing movements kind of redefine their focus in terms of these much more complex intersectional issues. So I think there's hope there that through that organic process, these movements are being redefined in ways that are relevant to the lived experiences of so many other people than it seemed at first blush. But that doesn't get into like the nitty gritty of how it's happening in the Black Lives movement with regards to trans people.
Well, I thank you guys for answering that. I know that was kind of a complicated question, so I appreciate you guys answering. And that was my last one. So I just want to say thank you for this. This was a really good presentation. I want to say, you guys, thank you guys one more time.
Thank you, Cole. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. We'll see you in class in a few minutes.
Yeah, I'll see you in a few minutes.
Okay.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.
Julia. Bye, Ken.
Thanks, May.
Bye-bye.
See you.